Paul's letter to the Philippians starts with these three words: Paul and Timothy. That's very appropriate that he brings Timothy into his story, because the genesis, the beginning of the story of the church at Philippi, takes you back to Acts chapter 16. Paul has met Timothy for the first time. He's described as a believer. Paul brings him on board, gets him circumcised to keep the Jews happy. Interesting, isn't it? And then they carry on, just a little way down in the same chapter, they arrive in Philippi for the first time. So Paul and Timothy are in operation for the first time at Philippi. So Philippi is Timothy's first experience of church planting. And so here we are a few years later. Now it's about AD 50, something like that. And Paul is writing back to them. And if you read Acts chapter 16, you'll find the full story of Paul's false imprisonment and the group that gathers around him, the friends that he made there on that first visit, and his presentation of the ongoing life of Jesus. And now Paul and Silas and Timothy, they left, and maybe Luke stayed on at Philippi, and Paul kept in touch with the Philippian church, with the Macedonian churches through Timothy, according to Acts 19. And Philippians chapter 2 and verse 19 and 20. And he visited them again and again, probably during the autumn of 54 AD and 55 AD, and then again in the spring of 55 or 56 AD, according to Acts chapter 20, 1 to 3. I'm telling you that because these were mates. These were people that he loved. And then when he says in chapter 1 of Philippians, I have you in my heart, that's the reason. I have you in my heart. It was as if he was saying, I carry your photograph in my back pocket. You are close to me. You are precious. They were precious because they were praying for Paul as well. And he mentions this again and again, because you prayed for me and you provided financial and material support several times during his journey. And when he's writing to the Corinthians in chapter 2 Corinthians, chapter 8, verses 1 to 5, he describes them this way. He brags to the Corinthian Christians about the Philippians. He said, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches, that's Philippi. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. They gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us, in keeping with God's will. Isn't that a great testimony? They were really poor and really generous. You often find that, don't you? That poor people, their generosity seems to come out of a different quality. I was interested to read about all these billionaires who pledged to commit themselves to the presidential campaigns in the United States. And you think, well, Jesus' reference was to the widow who gave out of her little all that she had, rather than those who were super rich having an agenda. You hear what I'm saying? And so Paul writes to these people. He writes to people who were in his heart. In fact, he describes them as sharing with Paul a partnership in the gospel from the first days in chapter 1 verse 5. Paul recalls this. In the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid again and again when I was in need. It's in chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. So this happy letter is very strong evidence of a deep, affectionate bond between Apostle and some of these converts. You know, when you share deeply, when you pray with someone and you see a change in their life, it makes a real connection between you. And some of those people, I can say from my own experience, without naming names, those people are with you decades later. Even if you don't see them again. People that led me to the Lord 30, 40 years ago, they're still there in my heart. And I go and check out with them and they check me that I've not become a heretic or something after all these years. So this happy letter tells you about that bond, But despite that affectionate tone, there's lots of negative situations going on at the same time, and Paul's trying to combat those situations. So he mentions in chapter 1 rival Christian preachers, in chapter 1 verses 15 to 18, and non-Christian opposition in verses 27 to 28, and chapter 3 18 to 19. And even within the group, he stops to mention these two ladies called Euodia and Syntyche, telling them to stop squabbling in chapter 4 verses 2 and 3. And then there's a more serious level of opposition, and it's referred to in chapter 3 as those dogs, those men who do evil, those mutilators of the flesh. And these are presumably Jewish Christian missionaries from the outside who wanted the Gentile Christians to become Jews in practice, specifically by being circumcised, as Timothy had been. But they wanted to make it a rule, a primary thing. Paul could understand it from a secondary perspective, but it was not a primary issue. So though Paul wrote to challenge these situations, to encourage the Philippian believers to be united and to quieten their dissension, he had other immediate concerns. One of their own members, called Epaphroditus, had visited Paul, and he'd fallen sick and almost died, but now he was well, and Paul wanted to reassure them about Epaphroditus and send him back to them to tell them how he was getting on. But throughout the letter he does more than this. It's not just these bits and pieces. He provides the inspiration and the encouragement of a friend, a mentor, and a fellow believer who finds Christ's strength and peace while struggling with all these stuff, opponents, anxiety, physical needs, even being afraid for his own life. Remember, he died in prison. And to see how a man, an apostle, meets every obstacle and overcomes them in Christ and still smiles, I find this so relevant, so powerful for my life. And I want to just keep posing that question to myself. How do I live a life like that, full of gratitude, full of joy, despite all the circumstances? How do you manage? May God bless you today.